I understand after China, there was no meaningful changes. The Iranians don't accept American proposals. The Americans don't accept Iranian proposals. And there's many now warning that a war could be mere hours away, or 24, 48 hours. How do you see this situation developing? The only source of relief or calm now seems to be that it doesn't make any sense. That it's unclear to me what can be achieved, which they didn't achieve in those 40 days. So what are we looking at here?
Well, if you look at the proposals that the Iranians and the Americans are making on how to settle this conflict, you see that they're light years apart. There's no bargaining space here in this conflict, as there is just as there's no bargaining space in the Ukraine/Europe Russia conflict. And therefore, you're not going to get a deal unless they're making concessions behind closed doors that we just don't know about. But there does not appear to be any evidence of that. Everything you see in the public record tells you there's just no agreement on any of the key issues between the two sides. And Trump is getting desperate. There's just no question about that. We started with a bombing campaign that lasted 40 days. That didn't work. So on April 8th, we moved to a ceasefire. And then our coercive leverage was supposed to come from the blockade. The blockade was the new formula for getting Iran to surrender. The original formula was the 40-day bombing campaign. That didn't work. Well, it's quite clear that the blockade is not working either. And that if it ever is going to work, it's going to take a long time. And time is something that Trump doesn't have. He's got to deal with this quickly. He's got to get a settlement because of the economic consequences of this war. And that means he has really two choices. He can go back to bombing, or he can basically cut a deal on Iran's terms. And he finds it almost impossible to cut a deal on Iran's terms. I think that he hoped that when he went to Beijing, he could talk to the Chinese, and the Chinese would be willing to put pressure on Iran. And the Iranians would end up making some significant concessions that would allow Trump to declare victory, even though he would have to make concessions himself. But at least the Iranians would make major concessions too. But there was no evidence the Chinese were willing. There is no evidence the Chinese were willing to do that. So China's not helping. So he's back to square one here. And the question is, what does he do? And I think one gets a sense that he might very well roll the dice and go back to bombing Iran. There's no question that the Israelis and the neoconservatives in the United States are pushing him in that direction. But the problem he faces is that using or launching another bombing campaign is not going to fix the problem. It's not going to cause the Iranians to surrender. Almost everybody understands that. You can inflict massive punishment on Iran, as we did in the first 40 days of the war, and they won't surrender. If anything, they'll become more committed than ever to, hanging in there. And then the other problem that Trump faces is that the Iranians have a second strike capability. And, if you think about restarting the bombing campaign, Glenn, it seems clear to me if it didn't work the first time, you're going to have to even go harder at them the second time. In other words, you're going to have to make the bombing campaign this time around even more intense. It makes common sense. If the bombing campaign didn't work the first time and you expect it to work the second time, it has to be because it's going to be a much more It's going to be a much more it's going to be a much more massive bombing campaign than the 40-day campaign we started the war with. But if you do that, that gives the Iranians a greater incentive to just wreck the entire Gulf, to go after almost every country in the Gulf and do everything possible to destroy those countries, shut down the Red Sea, and so forth and so on. And the end result is that even greater damage will be done to the international economy, and the Iranians will still be in the fight. So I don't see why, from a strategic point of view, Trump wouldn't just accept the fact that we've lost and cut a deal. Is it a good alternative? No, but it's the least bad alternative. Going back to bombing and launching a more massive bombing campaign that we did last time, it's not going to solve the problem. It's just going to make it worse, as I said. But anyway, you don't have the sense, at least from what we can see on the outside, that Trump is willing to make any meaningful concessions to the Iranians and let them walk away with a victory. So it appears that he may very well roll the dice.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm thinking. If it does going back into this war, it's going to have to be much higher intensity, despite being fewer military targets they have left. But that means, yeah, the Iranians have very little reason to have any restraint. As you said, they can shut down the Red Sea. They can essentially destroy a lot of the Gulf states. They can cut the internet cables. They can make a significant territorial conquests against Kuwait through you have the Iraqis do it. I mean, there's so much that can be done. This is why it's hard to imagine them going down this path. But let's say instead of escalating, going back into the war, Trump decides to instead strengthen the blockade. So one of the problems now is they have to have too far distance from the Iranian coast. But what if they moved it, for example, to the Strait of Malacca or something to cut off the Iranian ships there? Do you also, of course, bringing the war to some extent to China? Do you think this is something like this is possible, where they essentially begin to draw in more actors?
Well, the problem here is not where the blockade is located. The problem here is that the blockade does not inflict sufficient punishment on Iran to get it to surrender. And as long as Iran doesn't surrender and the Strait of Hormuz is closed, this has huge consequences for the international economy. And as time goes by, the situation just worsens. If you look at what's happening to inflation inside the United States and around the world, and you start thinking about the problems that various countries are having servicing their debt or their debts, and how this is likely to become a more acute problem over time, what you see is that the incentives for President Trump to shut this war down sooner rather than later are very great. But again, how does he do that? And I think where the blockade is located just doesn't matter very much. That's why I think that continuing the blockade is not a viable alternative. And I think the Trump administration recognizes that. That's why we're talking about going back to bombing. We're talking about going back to bombing because the blockade doesn't work. And you want to remember that just as the countries in the Gulf outside of Iran are looking for ways to beat the blockade, the Iranians themselves are looking for ways to beat the blockade. And all of the players have some options here. So the Iranians are hard at work trying to figure out different ways to get around the blockade, and they have some cards to play here. And that's what makes it very difficult to inflict the kind of punishment on Iran that might, and I underline the word might get the Iranians to surrender.
Well, I have a hard time seeing the overall strategy or direction of the US here, though. Where exactly are they going? Because we were told in the national security strategy of 25 that the US was likely heading in a more multipolar, well, adjusting to a multipolar distribution of power. Now we see a lot of these wars, they seem to have a objective of restoring primacy for no good reason. A lot of the relationships have been spoiled, for example, with the Europeans, the East Asians, well, the Gulf states are probably accidentally so, but international law is falling apart. No one's trusting diplomacy anymore. This is a key problem for the Iranian and the Russian side, is they wouldn't actually trust anything, not just at the US side, but the Europeans as well. So how do you, if you take a step back looking at all of these conflicts at the same time, how do you think the US will adjust to this? Because at one point I thought that the US could flip this to an opportunity. It could just argue, well, whenever we wanted to get out of the Middle East anyways, we're going to pivot out. The Europeans, they didn't help us, we'll go away from Europe too. And they can they could essentially make this adjustment to multipolarity, but it doesn't seem this is the pathway. So where is the US going here, though?
Well, with regard to Europe, what the United States is doing is shifting the burden of dealing with the Ukraine conflict onto the shoulders of the Europeans. And the United States is doing everything it can to wean itself off that conflict, let the Europeans handle it. With regard to East Asia, it's quite clear from Trump's recent trip to Beijing that what he's doing is going to great lengths to make sure that there's no crisis in East Asia, and certainly no war in East Asia involving the United States. That would be a total disaster for the United States, certainly at this point in time. And that brings us to the Middle East. This is where we are deeply involved in fighting a war. Again, we're not fighting the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting the war, and we've been helping them for sure, but we're not doing the actual fighting. And certainly we're not doing any fighting in East Asia, thankfully. But the place where we are doing the fighting is in the Middle East. This is the Iran war. And the question is, what can we do to get out of that? And, it's funny, but I often sort of think about the Vietnam War when I think about the Iran war. And you want to remember in 1968, after President Johnson says that he's not going to run again because he's effectively been destroyed by the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon runs against Hubert Humphrey, and Richard Nixon wins the election in November of 68, and he takes over in January of 69. And Nixon made it clear when he was campaigning that he had a secret plan to end the war, and he was going to end the war quickly. Well, if you look at what happened after Nixon comes into office, he was not interested in ending the war. He wanted to stay in the fight. He did not want to concede defeat. We actually thought, by 1972, that by using American air power and Vietnamese ground forces, that combination would allow us to hold off the North Vietnamese and forestall defeat. The Nixon administration did not want to lose in Vietnam. They were constantly searching for a clever strategy to make sure that we could win the war, or at least not lose the war. Of course, what happened in the end is that Congress forced Nixon's hand. Congress told the Nixon administration, you cannot use air power to rescue the situation. May 72, when we stopped the North Vietnamese offensive with tactical air power, was the last gasp. And after that, Congress made it impossible for the Nixon administration to prop up the government in Saigon with air power. And of course, what happened is that Saigon fell, the North Vietnamese won. But Nixon and, of course, Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor and then his secretary of state, they did not want to lose. It's not the American way. And just to go to Afghanistan, as you well know, we were there for 20 years fighting the Taliban. We did not want to lose that war. So what this tells you is when the United States gets into a war, even when it's losing, it is very difficult to accept defeat. Very difficult. The United States is a very powerful country, and it's constantly looking for a way to win. And this is, I think, the basic logic that you see at play in the case of Iran. You and I can point out to them that this war is lost. And in a certain sense, they recognize that, but they just won't accept it. And the belief is there's just got to be a magic formula out there. After all, this is the United States of America, the greatest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world. How can you tell me, how can you tell us that we can't defeat a small country like Iran? This can't be the case. It's that kind of logic that kicks in. And so what you see is Trump thrashing around and his advisors thrashing around looking for a solution. And there's very little evidence, at least in the public record, that anybody on the inside is saying this one's over. We lost. Let's recognize that, cut a deal, and minimize our losses. Which is what they should do, because the fact is that we lost this war and there's no way we can rescue the situation. But anyway, all of this is a long-winded way of saying, Glenn, it's going to be very hard to get the United States to accept the fact that it has been defeated by the Iranians. And we will do everything we can to figure out a way to win the war.
Well, I can see it's always been difficult for the US to accept a defeat, but the situation now looks even worse because the US is now, well, represented by the Trump administration, and he kind of built his whole persona or image on being the strong, great leader, making America great again, and then to be stopped in Iran, it's something that's very difficult to swallow. I mean, if you would be defeated by the Chinese or Russians, that would be one thing. But by Iran, as you said, this is something very difficult to accept. And furthermore, Trump bet everything on this war, it seems. That is, he was going to be a peace president, and then he went all in on this Iran war, assuming that it would be, peace through strength. But now all of this is gone. So do you worry about like a personal meltdown or the willingness to take desperate actions to, reverse the situation?
Well, I do worry about him taking desperate steps. And this is why I think there is a reasonable chance that he will go back to a massive bombing campaign. And that will be a massive bombing campaign. We will end up destroying a huge amount of infrastructure in Iran and killing many people. And this is what happens when countries become desperate. But my point to you is that it won't work. With regard to a meltdown, I think that may be overstating it. That may happen, but I think it's, again, I hate to keep going back to the Vietnam analogy, but I watched what happened to President Johnson. I was young at the time, but nevertheless remember very well, when we entered the war, full bore in March of 1965, and then what happened to President Johnson over the next, let's say, 3 years. By March 1968, it was all over for him. He said he was not going to run for another term. He was a defeated man. The war had worn him down. You could see it in his face. You could hear it in his voice. It was a devastating personal defeat for him, as well as a defeat for the country. And one can imagine a similar situation with regard to President Trump. He's not going to win this war. It's turned out to be the kind of war that he promised us he would never enter into. And of course, when he entered the war, he didn't think this was going to happen. And by the way, this is one of the big differences between Vietnam and this war. In the Vietnam War, Johnson understood full well that he was in effect entering a war where we had no formula for winning that war. He thought it was essential that we enter the war anyway and try and figure out how we could win it as we moved along. But he was very pessimistic from the get-go. This is different. Trump was optimistic. This one is like the Iraq War in 2003. You remember that, where the Bush administration was wildly optimistic about how the invasion of Iraq was going to turn out. And then, of course, President Bush landed on the aircraft carrier and declared that the mission had been accomplished. Of course, it all went to hell in a handbasket shortly after that. But in the case of Iraq, 2003, just like the case here in Iran on February 28th, we thought we were going to win a quick and decisive victory and live happily ever after. Very different than the Vietnam War. Johnson and his advisors did not have any illusions, but in this case, didn't work out very well. And the question is, what does Trump do now? And as you and I have said on a number of occasions in this show, he has no good option.
Well, at least in Iraq, the United States did, win in terms of winning the war, but it couldn't consolidate that victory. That is, the insurgency came, and it could be defined for a short period of time in Bush's defense, but with Iran there was never a victory at all, though, which makes it very difficult different. But there seems, I guess, the new branding now of the wars. It gives me a reason to be pessimistic. That is, that the wars are going to be escalated. For example, if you look in the European media now, they have reversed back to that Ukraine has turned the tide. Ukraine is winning again. This is the propaganda is dialed up to 100 again. So now suddenly, victory is we're gonna defeat the Russians again. They're going back to all of this nonsense. And on the US side, I thought it was a very interesting rebranding. That is, you see more and more references to, the Iran war is essentially over, which, the war which the United States started it with a surprise attack. This is over, but now there's a new conflict, which is that Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and America has to liberate this international waterway. Now, I'm not sure if this is, again, to resell the war as, this time we didn't attack, we're going to open it or, liberate it, or if this is just to sell it to Congress that this is a completely different war than the previous. I'm not sure. How are you seeing this? Because there's so much focus on the information war, the war of narratives these days, that but it's how the actors are seeking to shape the narrative. It is a good indication of where they're going to go with this, though.
Yeah, just to start with Ukraine, there's no question that if you look at the narrative in the West at this point in time, it's that the Ukrainians are winning. They've turned the tide. The Russians are on their back feet, and so forth and so on. The great danger there, Glenn, is that gives the Europeans and the Ukrainians an incentive to increase the attacks on the Russian homeland. The argument that people are making is that we finally have the Russians on the run, that these attacks are devastatingly effective, and let's just, ramp up the number and quality of the attacks, and we'll do even better on the battlefield. If you believe that rhetoric, as we discussed before, you're asking for really big trouble. to go to the case of Iran, I think there is some rebranding. I don't think it matters very much. Uh, the question is, what is the United States going to do to defeat Iran and to get our way? Is it going to involve opening the straits? I don't think anybody really believes that we can do that and achieve victory. I think that's why they're talking about the bombing campaign. It really seems to me that you're now at a point with regard to the Iran conflict or the Iran war where you have two choices. You can, well, maybe you have three choices. One is to continue the status quo. Two is to accept defeat, cut a deal. And number three is to restart the bombing campaign. Those are the options. But I don't think there's much serious talk about taking the strait. And if they even took the strait, that wouldn't be the end of it, because the Iranians have all sorts of counters that they can turn to. So I think, we are where we are with the Iran war.
Just my last question, is there any other card the US can play here? I mean, do you see any regional actors, Kurds, Azerbaijanis? I mean, anyone they could use, Pakistan, anyone who can essentially take the role of the Ukrainians of the Middle East, someone they can, or the Europeans for that sake, someone they can outsource the war to. It's just hard to see. I don't see anyone with the capabilities that is same as in Europe. I think Ukraine was kind of the last chance to defeat the Russians, but there's no other large proxy army you can build in that part of the world.
No, I mean, if the United States and Israel together could not defeat Iran, I mean, who else could? I mean, it looks like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are spoiling for a fight with Iran. And in fact, it appears that the UAE participated with the United States and Israel during the 40-day bombing campaign. But the UAE by itself is no match for Iran. And in fact, if the UAE were to get into a fight with Iran, I think the Iranians would destroy the UAE as a country. They'd go after the desalination plants. They'd go after their energy infrastructure. It would be a total disaster for the UAE. In fact, I don't understand why the UAE is not trying to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Iranians. But of course, they're not. But they're not in a position to take on the Iranians. No, I mean, this is, I think, very simple. If we can't do it militarily, we meaning the United States can't do it militarily with the Israelis, that means it can't be done. And we've failed. And therefore, we have to cut a deal. And that deal is going to reflect the fact that we lost and Iran won. And that is, at this point in time, unacceptable to the United States. And as you can imagine, Glenn, that is categorically unacceptable to the Israelis, because the Israelis view Iran as an existential threat, rightly or wrongly. And so if Trump were to be inclined to cut a deal that reflected the fact that we lost, the Israelis and their supporters in the United States would fight that mightily. And that, of course, makes you wonder, where is this train headed, right? Maybe what I'm saying here is that even if Trump is inclined to cut a deal, the pressure on him not to cut that deal from Israel and its supporters in the United States, who are enormously influential, could prevent him from sitting down with the Iranians. And then you say to yourself, where does this all lead?
Well, the media suggests we could be only a day or so away from returning to war with Iran, and I'm hearing that the Russians are gonna unveil some new weapons in Ukraine. So it looks like it's gonna be a very troubling week ahead. So let's check back again later. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No,
No.
I agree with you. I think we could title this talk "Up the Escalation Ladder." Just very depressing to think where we are, and it's also very depressing to think that two individuals like us who have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues really can't come up with stories to tell about either one of these two conflicts that have even a quasi happy ending. It's just very depressing.
I keep wondering if there's a feels like there's a wider problem we have now across the West. That is the inability to like objectively look at a situation. For years, at least between 2015 and 2022, I was always warning that we should do everything we can to implement the Minsk agreement. With we should be happy we have this. This can prevent a major war. If we ignore this, we're gonna invite a major war. And it was impossible to even have that discussion. Every time I tried to make this point, the argument more or less was, well, that's pro-Russian. If you're pro-Western or pro-Ukrainian, then you won't implement this because this would be a capitulation. So everything's dumbed down to pro this or pro that, and no one ever explained how they imagine this playing out. If you ignore this peace deal, you build up the Ukrainian army to the point where the Russians sees, okay, now we can't accept this existential threat. I mean, even now, we know what has happened by ignoring this peace, by escalating at every turn. This was not good for Ukraine. It's being destroyed. This is not good for the West. We're being weakened, being fragmented. No one can explain a convincing story how this was going to play out. And even after it all becomes a mess, they use it as an evidence for, well, look, we always told you that Russia was bad, but there's no serious discussion. And it's just, if you have to be pro this, and if you are, then you have to repeat these slogans. If you contest it, well, then you're with the enemy, essentially. I miss common sense. I miss actual discussions and debate. We definitely don't have it in this country, and it's a big problem across Europe. So anyways, yep.
Hard to disagree with you. Just one final point, Glenn, just going back to Vietnam. One thing I learned in those days, and it's been proven true over time, is that it's very easy for the United States to get involved in wars, but it's very difficult to get out. You get into these conflicts thinking you're going to win a quick and decisive victory, or you pursue a policy that looks like there's going to be big trouble ahead, but you say to yourself, I can deal with it. I can fix the problem as I move forward. But that is invariably not the case. You rarely win quick and decisive victories when you go to war. Sometimes you do, but when the United States picks a fight with a country like Iran, I say to myself when it starts that this one is going to be very difficult to get out of. Same thing is true when we invade when we invade Afghanistan and when we invade Iraq. We go into Iraq in 2003. We finally get out in 2011. Then we have to go back in 2014. And we still have troops on the ground in Iraq. We're still interfering in the politics of Iraq. It's really quite amazing. It took us 20 years to get out of Afghanistan. And the Vietnam War was another disaster. But anyway, getting into these conflicts is much easier than getting out of them. That's one lesson I learned a long time ago, and I think these conflicts prove that to be true.
Yeah, well, definitely. Yeah, that's been a lesson over the past 30 years as well. This forever wars, easy to start, hard to finish. And that will definitely be the lesson of the Iran war as well, as the Strait of Hormuz now seems to be lost. Anyways, thank you so much for taking the time, and hope to see you again soon.